The barn door groaned against the wind as Miles Veyer pushed it open, the lantern swinging in his hand, casting a restless glow across beams and stalls. Cold air rolled in after him, sharp and dry, the kind of cold that cut deeper in the bone. The longer one lingered. He was tired, his body begged for bed, but habit had never left him. A farmer double-checked, always. That habit came not just from seasons of tending land, but from years spent as a scout patrolling borders where hunger hollowed towns and desperation sharpened knives. He had seen too much of what carelessness cost. Tonight, like every night, he walked through the barn, eyes scanning for detailed dot. The mule shifted in its pen, hooves scratching wood. Tools were right where he'd left them. Grain sacks stacked tight in the corner. All was as it should be until one sack trembled, just once. Enough to stop him mid-step. He froze, lantern lifted higher. Mice could stir grain, but this was heavier. Controlled. His hand settled on the belt knife he always carried, in the years between the frontier and now closed like a trap. He moved slow, balanced, the silence pressing against his ribs. The sack shuddered again, this time deliberate. Crouching low, he set the lantern aside, drew the blade, and pressed one steady hand to the knotted throat of the sack. The rope had been tied from inside. That was wrong. No scavenger animal could manage that. Whoever was inside had climbed in and sealed themselves in tight. He cut the knot cleanly, the rope slipping loose. The canvas sagged open, and a pale arm slid out, not pale like any settler. The skin was faint violet, smooth as if light lived beneath it. Thin fingers trembled, not with attack, but with weakness. His breath slowed, the weight of the knife firm in his hand, though instinct told him it wouldn't be needed. He pulled. The sack further apart, and there she was. A woman, not human. Her body curled awkwardly inside rough canvas. White hair tangled across her face and shoulders. Silver thread fabric hanging in shreds that once might have been ceremonial. Her lips were cracked, her eyes half shut. She tried to move knees, scraping against the boards, but lacked the strength. When her gaze found him, found the knife in his hand, her throat worked around a whisper that broke itself into pieces. "Please don't send me back." The words hit the air like a stone dropped in still water. Miles didn't answer. He watched her, steady, weighed by silence. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't a trap. She was desperation folded into skin and bone. He slid the knife back into its sheath and stepped back, his expression unreadable. He fetched his old wool coat from a peg, shook the dust off, and laid it within her reach on the floor. "Put it on," he said, voice low, even. "Then we'll figure the rest out." For a long moment she only stared, as though it was a trick. Then she reached, her thin fingers pulling the fabric across her shoulders. It dwarfed her frame. Her bare feet curled against the cold planks as she tried to stand. She staggered, her knees folding, until Miles shifted the grain sack itself, bracing it so she could steady herself without his touch. He didn't put his hands on her. He didn't claim the moment. Once she was upright, he offered the lantern. "Hold it up so I can see you properly." The flame's glow painted abrasions along her collarbones, the dull metal band circling one wrist etched with patterns he didn't know. Her face was sharp, but worn by strain, her expression a brittle mix of exhaustion and pride. "Who are you?" Miles asked carefully. Her voice was faint, a string stretched thin. "Cereal." The name sat heavy in the barn air. "And what are you doing inside my grain sack?" Her lips tightened, shame flickering across her features. Grain masks scent. Men don't look inside sacks when they're tired. Practical, not madness. He respected that. It was survival, plain and simple. He set the knife aside, poured water from a tin cup, and held it out. She hesitated, suspicion flashing in her eyes, then took it. Each sip steadied her trembling throat, faint color returning to cracked lips. When she lowered the cup, his question came steady. "What did you mean? Don't send you back?" Her jaw clenched. She tapped the metal band with 2 fingers. "Back. To them. To the priests. To the binding. They call it union. It is prison." Miles studied her, the lantern glow catching on the strange sigils carved into the band. He said nothing for a long moment, the silence filled only by the mule's shifting in its stall. Finally, he nodded once. Decision made. "You'll sleep by the stove, warmest place in the house." Her eyes widened with disbelief and hope. "You would keep me here?" "You asked me not to send you back," he said simply. "That's good enough for tonight." Her gaze lingered on him, pale and luminous in the firelight. For the first time, she looked at him without flinching, and as she reached for the blanket he offered, the ring at her wrist caught the lantern's glow. The sigils shifted, faint lines humming almost too softly to hear. Miles's eyes narrowed, the knife heavy on his hip, as the word he had spoken choice hung in the cold air and made the metal sing. The farmhouse door closed with a heavy thud, sealing out the cold. Miles set the lantern down on the scarred wooden table, its glow pooling across chipped cups and the iron stove at the room's center. The warmth inside was faint, but after the barn, it felt like a refuge. He gestured toward the floor, near the stove. "Sit there. It's warmest." Cereal lowered herself carefully, the wool coat still swallowing her frame, the blanket he'd given wrapped close to her shoulders. Her eyes darted around the room as though every detail might be a trap. The mismatched chairs, the cracked window pane patched with resin, the small trunk pressed against the wall. It was plain, sparse, a room that belonged to a man who wasted nothing. Yet to her, it was unfamiliar enough to sharpen every muscle with tension. Miles poured stew from the dented pot into a bowl, the smell of roots and cured meat filling the air. He placed it on the floor beside her with a spoon, then stepped back, not looming, not hovering, just giving space. She stared at the bowl, her lips pressing into a line. Her hand hovered, then pulled back as if expecting him to snatch it away. "I don't make offers twice," he said evenly. "Eat." She searched his face, suspicious, then dipped the spoon into the thick broth and tasted. The moment the food hit her tongue, something inside her gave way. She ate slowly at first, every bite cautious, as though he might change his mind. But when nothing happened, when he simply leaned against the table with arms crossed, she ate with more urgency. Halfway through the bowl, her hand stilled. She set the spoon down. "You live here alone?" "Yes." Her pale eyes narrowed. "Why?" Fewer problems that way. It wasn't the answer she expected. Most men filled silence with words. He did not. His voice was as plain as his manner, carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than he cared to speak about. She pressed further. Families, clanshumans used to stay in groups. They used to. He didn't look at her, only at the fire. Not much left of that now. Her spoon trembled slightly as she lifted it again. "So no one comes here. No one knows." Miles turned his gaze to her, steady, unblinking. "No one knows you're here. No one will, unless you want them to." For the first time, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since she'd crawled into the sack. The tightness in her jaw eased, though suspicion still clung to her eyes. She put the spoon down, fingers gripping the rough edge of the table instead. "They'll look for me." "Who?" His voice was calm, but direct. "My own people. The priests." Her hand moved to the metal band on her wrist, covering it as though ashamed. "They said it was honor. They promised a union, a binding. But it was never a choice. They would have made me property, Not a woman, not myself. The words came raw, without drama, like she had carried them so long they had cut her hollow. She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at the fire, as if confessing to. Flame hurt less. Miles's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't rush to speak. Empty comforts meant nothing to him, and he knew they would mean less to her. When he did answer, his voice was steady. You're not property here. That's not how it works. Her gaze snapped to him, searching for a catch. Men say that. They always say that. Then they take what they want. He didn't look away. Then stay awake tonight. Watch me. See if I do. The fire popped in the stove, filling the silence that followed. She stared at him, eyes narrowed, weighing his. Every word, every stillness. But he was the same as he had been since the barn calm, deliberate. Unmoved by her suspicion dot, at last she picked up the spoon again, finished the stew in silence. When she was done, he took the bowl, rinsed it at the basin, and set it aside. He placed a blanket and pillow near the stove. That's yours for tonight. You'll be warm here. She glanced at the door. And you? I'll sit there. He pulled out the straight-backed chair by the entry and sat, arms folded, knife. At his side. I sleep light. If anyone comes, I hear it first. Her lips pressed together, unreadable. Maybe relief, maybe doubt. But she lowered herself to the floor, pulling the blanket tight. The coat slipped open at her shoulder, and she did not fix it this time. Her eyes stayed wide, staring at the beams above, listening to the silence. Miles leaned back in the chair, boots firm on the floor, gaze fixed on the door. The quiet between them thickened heavy, but not hostile. When her breathing slowed, when her eyes began to flutter shut, he finally allowed himself a glance. Not to measure her beauty, but to measure fragility. He knew how little it took to break a person already on the edge. As the fire dimmed, her hand twitched in sleep, brushing against the metal band. The sigils flickered faintly in the shadows, a whisper of light no human craft had made. Miles's eyes narrowed at the sight, his body still as stone dot in the silence. A faint hum rose from the ring, so low it seemed part of the fire itself, until the word he had spoken earlier echoed in his mind. Choice. The metal pulsed once, as if it had heard him. Dawn slid pale and cold through the shutters, painting the farmhouse in weak gray light. Miles rose before it, as he always did. Years of scouting had carved discipline into his bones, and farming had only sharpened it. He stoked the stove, boiled water, and cut what little bread he had left. The simple rhythm steadied him, easier to hold on to than the thoughts of the strange woman sleeping, curled on his floor-dot cereal, stirred slowly, blinking into the unfamiliar light. For a brief instant, panic flickered in her eyes, until she saw him moving at the stove, his back turned, deliberate in his distance. She sat up, pulling the blanket tighter. Her gaze darted to the door. You kept it locked, she whispered. Habit, Miles said, not looking at her. Not a cage. Keys are there. He nodded toward the table. Her eyes found them, lying within reach of anyone who wanted them. A gesture simple, it made her chest tighten. Most men would never have offered her that kind of freedom, not even for a night. She swallowed, silent, then rose unsteadily, bare feet brushing the cold floor. He turned, setting a cup of broth in her hands, crouching low so she didn't have to look up. She sipped, the warmth easing the edge of her voice. Why do you live out here apart from others? Most humans cling together. Miles sat back on his heels, his face shadowed in the half-light. I was a scout once. Spent years walking borders. When colonies still tried to hold. When everything broke, I didn't go back. Out here, it's quiet. Fewer mouths to feed. Fewer knives in the dark. His voice was flat, not sad, just final. She studied him, but there was no crack in the mask. When she pressed again, softer this time, "And no one you miss?" He only said, "No one left." The words landed like stone. She let them be. Later that morning, she followed him outside for the first time. Frost clung to the earth, brittle underfoot. Miles moved with steady rhythm, checking fences, feeding the mule, scattering grain. His world was one of order, rows, of tools neatly hung, soil turned with care, animals tended with quiet patience. Cereal tried to help, lifting a bucket of grain, but her strength failed her, the weight pulling her sideways. Miles stepped forward, steadying it with one hand before. It spilled. His other hand brushed hers for only a second, a brief touch, but it lingered longer in her mind than it should have. He took the bucket easily, carried it to the stall, and set it down. "You don't need to break your back to prove yourself," he said, his tone as plain as ever. Her chest tightened. For so long, her worth had been measured in obedience, in endurance. Here he dismissed the idea entirely. She lowered her gaze, hiding the faint relief that cracked her pride. By noon, they returned to the farmhouse. He mended a broken fence post by the fire, his hands moving with the precision of a soldier disguised as a farmer. She sat near the stove, fingers absently tugging at the blanket, until her eyes found the metal band still circling her wrist. Miles noticed. He set down the tools, his storm-gray gaze heavy on her. "That ring," he said. "What does it do?" Her hand froze. Silence stretched. "It binds," she murmured at last, her voice low. "Not with force you can see, but with meaning. Once it closes, you are someone's. The priests call it sacred. I call it a chain. Does it track you?" His voice was level, but the question cut sharp. "No, but if they see it, they know. They'll say I belong." That explained the constant weight in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. He reached for a hammer lying near the hearth, weighing it in his hand. For a heartbeat, she thought he meant to strike. "We could take it off," he said. Her eyes widened, fear cutting through exhaustion. "No, if you try and fail, it tightens. Some don't survive." He held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then he set the hammer down gently. "Then we wait until we know how, but it's coming off, one way or another." Shock rippled across her face. Promises had always been words that dissolved when tested, but he spoke like the decision was already carved in stone. For the first time, she felt something stir beneath her fear. Not trust, not yet, but the faint recognition of someone who might actually mean what he said. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Miles leaned back, his knife glinting faintly at his side. Cereal pulled the blanket tighter, her fingers brushing the sigils on the ring. And just as they had in the barn, they flickered once, as if listening. The wind carried a bite sharper than frost that evening, hissing through the brittle stalks at the edge of Miles Vayer's land. He moved with the quiet focus of a man who had walked many perimeters before, eyes low to the ground, steps deliberate, ears tuned to every sound beyond the ordinary. The mule shifted restlessly in its stall. A crow startled from the fence post, its wings beating too hard for the hour. He crouched near the tree line, lantern shielded by his hand. In the shallow crust of frost, he found them, scuffed earth, heel of a boot where no settler should walk, and the broken line of a horse's hoofprint. Not scattered like raiders, organized, deliberate. His jaw tightened as he brushed frost from the mark. Whoever was watching the farm had patience. That was worse than hunger-driven thieves. When he returned to the house, cereal was still by the stove, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up sharply, as if she'd felt the air shift through the walls. "You're restless," she said softly, her voice halfway between question and admission. "Someone's been near the fence," Miles answered. He set the lantern down, his tone plain, but his shoulders carried the weight of the old scout returning to life. Not scavengers. They moved like they knew what they wanted. Her lips pressed thin. Her hand crept to the band on her wrist, hiding it in the folds of the blanket. "Then they're closer than I thought." Miles leaned against the table, arms crossed, gaze steady. "You're going to tell me who they are. No more waiting." Her eyes flicked to the door, as though she expected shadows to seep through the wood itself. "Priests," she whispered, "from my people. They travel with escorts, bound by oath to retrieve what they claim is theirs. And you?" Her throat tightened. "To them, I'm a vessel. The binding would make me someone's. They say it is honor, but it is only erasure. Once sealed, I could bear no thought, no child, no word of my own. Everything would belong to the one who held the other ring." The fire snapped, scattering sparks up the iron throat of the stove. Miles didn't look away. His expression stayed level, but a hard edge had cut into his voice. "That's what you were running from." She nodded, eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I hid in the sack because no one looks there twice. Hunger makes people blind. I thought if I looked like nothing, I would be safe." His hand brushed the hilt of his knife, a gesture more of habit than threat. "You stay here. You follow my rules. That means honesty. If danger follows you to my door, I need to be ready. No surprises." Her chin lifted then, pride flaring through fear. "And if I am not honest, then you leave." His answer came, hard, without hesitation. The words cut sharper than he intended, and he saw them land like a blow. She recoiled slightly. The blanket clutched to her chest as though bracing for him to throw her out now. But he didn't move. He let the silence stretch until she could feel its shape. At last her voice broke through, low, trembling. "I don't want to leave." He exhaled, slow, controlled, and the steel in his eyes softened just enough. "Then don't." The stoves. Light flickered between them, painting her face in shifting shadow. For the first time, she didn't look at the floor when she spoke. "I don't know how to be free." Miles's voice stayed steady. "You start by choosing. Tonight you chose to stay. That's a start." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. She pressed her hand tighter against the band on her wrist. The sigils flared faintly, a pulse of light hidden beneath her skin. She didn't notice, but Miles did. His storm-gray eyes lingered on the glow, as though it were a fuse waiting to be lit out when he went out again to secure the gate. A small shape caught on the wood stopped him cold. Wired to the fence post was a token, carved bone etched with lines. That matched the markings on Cyriel's ring. The priests had left their sign. Miles tore it free, his fist closing around it, the weight of a challenge pressing into his palm. Inside, the farmhouse was warm with fire, but outside the fields whispered with the presence of men who had not yet shown themselves. The night pressed heavy over the farmhouse, the kind of dark that seemed to have weight. Miles sat at the table, with his knife across his lap, oiling the blade in slow, measured strokes. The steady rhythm of cloth against steel matched the cadence of his breathing. He wasn't sharpening for vanity. He was reminding himself of readiness. Outside, the wind dragged across the fields. Somewhere beyond the tree line, men waited dot by the stove. Cyriel pulled her knees up under the blanket. The fire threw orange light over her violet skin, shadows rising and falling with every flicker. She hadn't spoken for a long while, but he could feel her eyes on him, restless and uncertain. At last, her voice broke the silence, soft and ragged. "I dream of them," she whispered. "The priests. Their voices chanting words I never chose. In the dream, I try to say no, but my mouth makes no sound. I wake and still feel it, as if the vow has already been spoken through me. Miles sat, the knife down carefully, folding the cloth beside it. "Dreams can't bind you," he said, her gaze lifted, sharp and haunted. "But memory can. Even here, I feel it pressing on me. This thing," she tugged at the ring on her wrist, "the metal rasping against her skin, says I belong. And what if I start to believe it?" The words hung in the firelit air. Miles leaned back, his chair creaking softly, eyes steady on hers. "I don't need priests or rings to know what belongs to me," he said, his tone plain, hard as stone. "And I don't need either to know what doesn't." Her lips parted, her breath catching at the bluntness. She turned her face away, blinking against the sting of tears she hadn't expected. She had heard 1,000 declarations from men before, all honeyed with false promises. This was different, sharper. It left her free instead of cornered, and that was more frightening than chains. The wind slammed against the shutters, and she jumped, clutching the blanket closer. The coat slipped from her shoulder, skin catching firelight in a glow that made her look almost fragile. Miles noticed, but his gaze held steady, not leering, not claiming, only acknowledging her. That, too, unsettled her. Her voice quivered. When she spoke again, not to him, but almost to herself. "I don't want to be alone in this." He heard it anyway. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed his chair back from the table and crossed the floor. The boards creaked under his weight, but he stopped short of her, crouching beside the stove. He didn't reach for her. He didn't touch. He simply set his hand flat on the floor near hers, leaving the choice in her hands. For a long, breathless moment, she stared at the space between them. Then, almost reluctantly, she slid her hand across the wood until her trembling fingers brushed against his. Heat passed between them, steadier than the stove. She felt it calm, grounded, unyielding. Her lips parted on a whisper. "If they come, don't let them touch me." Miles's reply came low, controlled, a promise forged like iron. "They won't." The blanket slipped further from her shoulders, but she didn't pull it back this time. She leaned against his arm, her white hair spilling across his sleeve. His body went still, rigid with restraint, but his presence was a wall she could rest against. The trembling that had haunted her since the sack eased, her breathing finally slowing into rhythm. Minutes passed. The fire cracked and sighed. She drifted into sleep, her fingers still brushing his. For the first time since she fled, she slept. Without waking in fear, Miles kept his watch, knife within reach, eyes fixed on the door. He had promised, and promises mattered. Yet in the dark, while the wind dragged its whispers across the fields, he admitted to himself what he had tried not to name. She was no longer just a burden he had stumbled across. She had become his responsibility. And the line between responsibility and something deeper had already begun to blur at the edge of the tree line. Where the fields met shadow, a faint horn sounded low and mournful, a ritual note. The priests were closer now. The horn sounded. Again at dusk, low and deliberate, rolling over the frost-stiff fields. Miles heard it before Cyril stirred, the sound pulling him from his work at the fence line. He stood with one hand on the post he'd been mending, eyes narrowed toward the tree line, where the gray light bled into darker shapes. They hadn't hidden themselves this time. That was message enough. When he stepped back into the farmhouse. Cyril was already on her feet, blanket clutched tight around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, her breath shallow. She had heard the horn too. "They found me." Miles set the tools down on the table with deliberate calm. "And they'll come to the door." Her voice cracked. "If you give me back, they'll finish it, the binding. I'll be gone." He met her gaze, storm-gray eyes unflinching. "Not unless you walk to them yourself." The words landed like iron, but before she could answer, the first knock came. Not frantic, not timid measured, like the toll of a bell. Miles crossed the room and opened the door himself. 3 figures stood in the dim light. The first wore robes the color of ash, hands folded, face hidden beneath a hood. 2 escorts flanked him, broad-shouldered, armored in dull metal, eyes as cold as winter water. They carried no torches. The priest's lantern alone lit their faces. The robed figure inclined his head. Farmer. His voice was smooth, the weight of ritual in every syllable. You shelter one who belongs to us. Return her, and you will be left in peace. Miles leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, the picture of a man unimpressed. She walked into my barn. I didn't drag her here. The priest's voice sharpened, though still calm. Choice is illusion when duty calls. She carries the mark. The union ring has bound her fate. You defy what was written. Behind Miles, Cyriel's voice rose, trembling but fierce. It was never my choice. The priest's head tilted, the jihas, hood shifting just enough to show a mouth, curving in pity or contempt. The union is not for you to accept or reject. It is sanctified. It is law. Miles's jaw tightened. He stepped slightly aside, enough for them to see Cyriel standing. By the stove, blanket clutched, hair glowing pale in the firelight. He didn't shield her, didn't drag her forward. He let her be seen, but on her terms. If it's law, Miles said, his voice low, then it's law made by thieves. One of the escorts shifted, hand brushing the hilt of his blade. The priest raised a hand to still him, and lifted his lantern higher. Its light struck the metal ring on Cyriel's wrist, and the sigils carved into it, flared lines of light racing in sequence, bright enough to paint the rafters. The hum they had whispered in private now filled the room, deep and resonant. Cyriel gasped, her hand flying to the band. It's never done that before. The priest's composure cracked for the first time. His voice strained, as though he spoke through clenched teeth. The lattice awakens, yet she is unsealed. Miles took a slow step forward, his knife now in his hand, point angled down but ready. You said it yourself. Choice isn't yours. It's hers. The sigils pulsed again, answering his words. Cyriel stared at the glowing ring, her lips trembling. Every chant, every vow forced upon her came back like claws raking her skin. She shook her head, tears glinting in the firelight. No, she whispered. Not this time. I choose my own life. The ring blazed, a wash of light spilling across the room. The escorts staggered back, shielding their eyes. The priest's lantern sputtered and went out. Miles didn't flinch. He stood steady in the doorway, knife glinting in the glow, his body a wall between her and them. The fire snapped in the stove. Outside, the horn fell silent. The farmhouse glowed as if it had become a lantern itself. The sigils on Cyriel's wrist burning bright enough to throw shadows across the rafters. The hum deepened until the walls seemed to vibrate. Miles stayed rooted in the doorway, knife steady at his side, eyes on the robed figure swaying just beyond the threshold. The priest's voice cracked now, stripped of its calm authority. This is not possible. The lattice does not answer the unbound. Cyriel staggered, clutching the ring as though it seared her skin. They told me it meant I belonged to them, that I had no say. Her voice rose, steadying with each word. But it listens to me. The light flared in response, brighter, alive with resonance. Her eyes widened, reflecting the glow. For the first time she looked at the ring not with fear, but with recognition. Stepped forward, narrowing the distance between himself and the priest. Seems your law's a lie. The escorts shifted, blades half drawn, but something in the light stopped them. The sigils weren't random. They raced in ordered patterns, weaving into symbols older than the priesthood itself. Ancient geometry spiraled across Cyriel's skin, a language long forgotten by those who claim to keep it. The priest hissed, his hood falling back to reveal a face ashen with disbelief. The lattice awakens only when witnessed. Only when. His words faltered. His eyes slid to Miles. Cyril followed that gaze. Her breath caught. It heard you, she whispered. Every time you said the word. Every time you didn't touch unless I chose. It was listening. The truth cut through. Her like fire. The priests had called it binding, a shackle dressed as sacrament. But the lattice wasn't made for chains. It was a recorder of will, of consent. Every gesture Miles had made, the coat laid within reach, the key left on the table, the blanket offered without claim, had been proof enough to stir its dormant. Powered out, the escorts took a stumbling step back, eyes wide as the ring's glow spilled onto their armor. For the first time, they looked uncertain, like men stripped of their orders. Cyril's voice rang clear, louder than she thought she could. Speak. I am not yours, not your vessel, not your property. One choose myself. The sigils blazed white-hot, then exploded outward in a shock of light that tore through the dark. The token Miles had torn from the fence, post cracked in his fist, its false etchings dissolving to ash. Across the fields, unseen but felt, other echoes stirred, rings far away flickering, patterns shattering wherever women had been silenced beneath the same law. The priest fell to his knees in the snow, hands outstretched, his voice broken. You've undone generations. Miles's tone was flat, merciless. She did. By choosing? Cyril turned toward him, her body trembling with the aftershock of the lattice's awakening. Her lavender eyes were luminous now, lit with something fiercer than fear. She stepped forward, closer to him, the blanket falling from her shoulders. The cold bit her skin, but she didn't flinch. They can't take me anymore. No, Miles said, knife still ready, though the fight had already been won. Not unless you walk to them yourself. Her lips parted, and this time there was no hesitation. Then I'll never walk to them. The words settled into the air like an oath. The glow of the ring softened, then dimmed, but the sigils didn't vanish. They rested like a promise beneath her skin. A bond not of chains, but of her own declaration. The escorts turned, retreating into the trees, their blades sheathed, their silence louder than defiance. The priest remained kneeling, his authority burned hollow by the very device he had twisted for power. Miles shut the door in his face, the thud final, the farmhouse once again claimed by warmth and FIRELIG. Tate. Cyril swayed, exhaustion threatening to drop her where she stood. Miles reached out, slow and deliberate, his hand hovering just short of her arm. She met his eyes, then nodded once, faint but certain. He caught her, steadying her against his chest. You're safe now, he said, voice low, unyielding. Not for a night, not for a season, for as long as you choose. Her eyes closed, a faint smile curving her lips. Then I choose forever. Outside, the wind scoured the fields clean, carrying away the last echoes of the horn. Inside, the farmhouse stood firm, its walls holding not ritual, not law, but the fragile, unshakable truth that survival meant nothing without freedom. The story that had begun with a trembling sack ended here, in the heartbeat of choice.